The snow had not stopped falling for 3 days. It came down in thick, punishing sheets that covered the Wyoming-Montana borderlands like a shroud. The cold carried with it the smell of pine, gunpowder, and something else, something heavy and ancient, like a promise long forgotten. 3 wolves circled a toppled wagon in the growing darkness, their yellow eyes fixed on the trembling figure pressed against the broken wheel. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, her face pale as the snow around her hands clutching a tattered shawl that offered little protection against the bitter cold. The lead wolf, a massive gray beast with a scarred muzzle, lowered its head and prepared to lunge. Then came the sound, sharp and definitive, cutting through the howling wind. One shot, one wolf down. 2 more shots followed in rapid succession, each finding its mark with deadly precision. The remaining wolves collapsed in the bloodied snow, their final breaths forming small clouds in the frigid air. Mason Blackwood lowered his Winchester rifle and emerged from the tree line, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the disturbed snow. At 42, his face was weathered like tanned leather, carved by years of harsh winters and harder choices. The war between the states had taken his youth. The frontier had taken everything else, everything except his aim. "You hurt?" His voice was gravel wrapped in whiskey, unused to conversation. The girl stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes. She didn't respond. "I asked if you're hurt," Mason repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. He approached carefully, noting the brand on the overturned wagon. "Cooper." The name hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years, not since Thomas Cooper had died in his arms during the war, whispering final instructions about a gold mine and a daughter who needed protection. Mason looked more carefully at the girl. Sarah Cooper, it had to be, and recognized Thomas's eyes staring back at him. The same determined gaze that had once saved his life at Gettysburg. "You're deaf, aren't you?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "That's what they told everyone." Sarah's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in her eyes. Caution, perhaps, or recognition. Mason had known this moment would come ever since he'd caught wind of Margaret Cooper's plan to rid herself of her stepdaughter. The plan had worked perfectly. Too perfectly. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was an ambush, not with bullets, but with guilt, the kind that could make a man lower his guard. "Your stepmother sold you, didn't she?" Mason said, watching her face for any reaction. "Told everyone you were useless, a burden." For the briefest moment, Sarah's eyes narrowed. Mason caught it, the micro-expression of someone who understood every word. His suspicions were confirmed. This girl wasn't deaf. She was hiding something, just like he was. "I knew your father," Mason said, offering his hand, "and I think we're both in more danger than you realize." The town of Frostwood consisted of little more than a dusty main street lined with weather-beaten buildings that leaned against the wind like tired men. The general store, saloon, and sheriff's office formed the trinity of frontier civilization. Beyond them lay only wilderness and the unwritten laws of survival. Mason led his horse through the knee-deep snow. Sarah perched awkwardly behind him. Her hands gripped his coat with surprising strength for someone so small. They drew stares as they passed. Mason Blackwood, the reclusive rancher who owned half the valley, and a girl no one recognized. The saloon door swung open, releasing a cloud of smoke and drunken laughter into the bitter air. Margaret Cooper stumbled out, her face flushed with whiskey and greed. Behind her loomed Frank Holloway, a man whose every feature seemed designed for cruelty. "Right on time, Blackwood," Margaret called, her sweetness as false as her smile. "I see you found my stepdaughter. Poor thing, deaf as a fence post and twice as useless." Mason dismounted without a word and helped Sarah down. The girl's eyes remained downcast, her posture submissive, a carefully constructed facade. "Sheriff Wallace here?" Mason asked, his voice deliberately flat. Inside, Margaret replied, waving dismissively, though I don't see why you need him for a simple transaction. $5 is more than fair for damaged goods. Frank stepped forward, his spurs jingling a discordant melody against the wooden boardwalk. You remember me, Blackwood? Been a long time since Virginia. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward the Colt at his hip. 15 years isn't long enough, Holloway. The air between them crackled with unspoken history, the kind written in blood and betrayal. Sheriff Wallace emerged from the saloon, a tall man with a silver mustache and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. This doesn't feel right, Mason. Nothing about it is right, Mason agreed, counting out coins into Margaret's outstretched palm. But some wrongs need to be set right in their own time. The transaction complete, Mason turned to leave, motioning for Sarah to follow. The crowd that had gathered watched in silence, their judgment hanging in the air like gun smoke. Enjoy your purchase, Frank called after them, his voice dripping with insinuation. Hope she's worth every penny. Mason didn't turn around. He knew better than to show his back to a snake. The ambush came 3 miles outside of town, at the narrow pass where the river bent around jagged rocks. 2 riders appeared from behind a snowdrift, bandanas pulled high over their faces, revolvers drawn. Hand over the girl and your money, Blackwood, the first man demanded. Mr. Holloway sends his regards. Mason moved with the fluid precision of a man who'd faced death many times before. His first shot caught the speaker in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. But as Mason turned to the second attacker, a bullet grazed his arm, tearing through coat and flesh with burning precision. The second rider leveled his gun for a killing shot. 3 things happened at once. Mason fell to one knee, his rifle tumbling into the snow. Sarah slid from the horse with unexpected agility, and the fallen revolver somehow found its way into her hands. The shot that followed wasn't skilled or practiced, but at that range it didn't need to be. The attacker fell backward, clutching his thigh, his scream echoing across the valley. Mason stared at Sarah, who held the smoking gun with steady hands and eyes that held no trace of fear or confusion. No trace of deafness either. You can hear, Mason stated flatly, binding his wound with a bandana. And that wasn't your first time holding a gun. Sarah remained silent, but her eyes spoke volumes. Caution, assessment, survival. I don't need to know all your secrets, Mason continued, retrieving his rifle, but I need to know if you're running from the same people I am. After a long moment, Sarah nodded once, decisively. Then we have work to do. Mason mounted his horse and offered his hand. This valley needs people who can defend it, and I made a promise to your father. Blackwood Ranch sprawled across the southern end of Echo Valley like a kingdom unto itself. 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, natural springs, and defensive positions that a military man could appreciate. The main house stood on a rise overlooking the valley, built of heavy logs and river stone, with gun ports disguised as windows. Mason led Sarah through the house methodically, showing her where everything was kept: food stores, weapons, escape routes. He spoke as if she could hear every word, because now he knew she could. The east bedroom is yours, he said, opening a door to reveal a Spartan but clean space. Lock the door at night. Trust no one until I say otherwise. Sarah nodded, taking in every detail with the sharp awareness of prey that had learned to become predator. That night, Mason sat at his kitchen table, cleaning his Winchester, when Sarah appeared with a small slate board. On it, she had written in neat, precise letters, "They killed my father, didn't they?" Mason looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yes, but not in the war. After." She erased the slate with her sleeve and wrote again, "For the gold mine?" "Partly," Mason admitted, "but also because your father knew things. About Frank, about the smuggling operation across the border, about who really started the fire that killed half the town 5 years ago." Sarah's eyes widened. She wrote quickly, My stepmother said it was an accident. Margaret Cooper has been telling lies for so long, I doubt she remembers the truth, Mason replied, reassembling his rifle with practiced movements. Frank Holloway was a deserter during the war, a thief who left his own men to die. Your father was going to expose him. Sarah's hand trembled as she wrote her next question. Why did they let me live? Mason's expression darkened. Because they thought you couldn't hear their plans, couldn't testify against them. But now they've made a mistake. They've put you right where you need to be to help me stop them. For the first time, Sarah's face showed a flicker of something beyond fear or caution, determination, perhaps even hope. Tomorrow we start training, Mason said, standing. You need to learn to defend this place and yourself. The days that followed established a rhythm. Mason taught Sarah how to maintain the ranch, feeding livestock, repairing fences, watching for signs of intruders. In the evenings, he taught her to fight, not with the brute strength she didn't possess, but with speed, precision, and cunning. Sarah remained silent but attentive. She learned to handle Mason's spare revolver, to load and clean it with mechanical efficiency. Her aim improved rapidly, her natural instincts honed by desperation. Jackson, the ranch foreman, and the handful of loyal cowboys who worked the property regarded her with curious respect. They had learned not to underestimate anyone Mason Blackwood deemed worthy of his time. One morning, 3 weeks after Sarah's arrival, Jackson rode in at full gallop, his horse lathered despite the cold. 3 more horses gone, he reported, dismounting. Found tracks leading east toward the ravine. And this. He held out a shell casing. Mexican ammunition, the kind they don't sell legally this side of the border. Mason examined the casing and nodded grimly. They're getting bolder, starting to show their hand. That night, Mason unfolded a map across the kitchen table as Sarah watched. He pointed to a location marked with a faded X. Your father's gold mine. It's not just about the gold anymore. Though there's plenty there, it's about location. His finger traced a line from the mine to the Mexican border. Perfect smuggling route. Holloway's been bringing in illegal weapons, selling them to both sides of every conflict he can find. The mine would give him a way station, storage, and legitimacy all at once. Sarah wrote on her slate, How many men does he have? At least 15, maybe more by now. Her next question was simple. How many do you have? 7 I'd trust with my life, Mason replied honestly. Plus Sheriff Wallace, if it comes to that. And you. Sarah's eyebrows rose in question. Yes, you, Mason confirmed. You've got more reason to fight than most, and I've seen what happens when people underestimate you. A ghost of a smile crossed Sarah's face. The first Mason had seen. That smile vanished the following night when Frank Holloway's men set fire to the eastern stable. The attack came just after midnight, a coordinated strike designed to draw out Mason's men and spread them thin. The firefight was brutal and efficient. Mason's men had the advantage of knowing the terrain, but Holloway's gang had numbers. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass as flames painted the snow-covered ground in shades of hell. Mason moved like a vengeful spirit through the chaos, his Winchester speaking death with every shot. He had almost reached the burning stable when a shadow detached itself from behind a water trough, revolver raised. The shot that saved Mason's life didn't come from his own gun, but from the main house where Sarah had positioned herself at a second-story window. Her bullet caught the attacker in the upper back, dropping him instantly. 3 more of Holloway's men fell before they retreated into the darkness, leaving behind their dead in the still-burning stable. Mason organized his men to fight the fire, his mind racing ahead to what would come next. He didn't see the shooter on the ridge until it was too late. The bullet caught him high in the chest, spinning him into the snow. The world tilted, darkened, then disappeared altogether. Mason woke to searing pain and Sarah's face hovering above his. He was in his bedroom, stripped to the waist, his shoulder and chest bound with blood-soaked bandages. Jackson stood nearby, his expression grim. "Bullet missed your heart by an inch," the foreman explained. "You've been out for 2 days. Would have been dead if not for her." Mason looked at Sarah questioningly. "She told us what to do," Jackson continued, the surprise still evident in his voice. "Told us how to remove the bullet, how to clean the wound. Girl's got a voice after all, and she knows her medicine." Sarah looked away, embarrassed or perhaps afraid. When she turned back, her eyes held a plea for understanding. "You did what you had to," Mason said weakly. "No need to explain." That night, as fever gripped him, Mason drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he heard Sarah speaking softly to Jackson about wound care, her voice raspy from disuse, but clear in its instructions. The sound anchored him to the living world when the darkness threatened to claim him. On the third day, Mason woke clear-headed to find Sarah dozing in a chair beside his bed. When she opened her eyes and saw him watching her, she didn't pretend anymore. "How long have you been able to speak?" he asked. "Always," she replied, her voice low and hesitant. "I stopped after what I saw." "Frank killing someone?" She nodded. "A woman who worked for my father. She knew about the mine, too. I was 13, hiding in the closet when it happened." Her words came slowly, as if each one required effort to push past years of enforced silence. "Frank told my stepmother that anyone who heard his plans would meet the same end, so I became deaf. It was safer." Mason attempted to sit up, wincing with the effort. "It's time to end this, Sarah. I've let it go on too long already." "We're outnumbered," she reminded him. "Not if we choose the battlefield," Mason replied. "Your father taught me that in the war. Sometimes a smaller force wins by controlling where and when the fight happens." Sarah helped him stand, supporting his weight with surprising strength. "Then let's make it happen on our terms," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm tired of hiding." Mason looked down at her, no longer seeing the frightened girl from the wagon, but a survivor, an ally. He handed her his Colt. "Then it's time you learn to shoot properly. A gun like this has a kick that'll break your wrist if you don't respect it." Sarah's fingers closed around the revolver with quiet determination. "Teach me everything." Margaret Cooper arrived at Blackwood Ranch on a clear, cold morning 2 weeks later. She came alone in a borrowed buggy, her face a mask of motherly concern that didn't reach her eyes. Mason watched her approach from the porch, rifle resting casually across his knees. His wound had healed enough for him to move without pain, though his full strength hadn't returned. "I've come for my stepdaughter," Margaret announced, not bothering to dismount. "The poor child must be frightened, living among strangers." "She seems comfortable enough," Mason replied evenly. "Why don't you ask her yourself?" Sarah stepped out onto the porch, standing straight back beside Mason. The change in her was evident. Confidence had replaced fear. Purpose had erased submission. Margaret's facade slipped momentarily. "Sarah, dear, gather your things. I've come to take you home where you belong." Sarah met her stepmother's gaze and did what years of self-preservation had taught her never to do. She spoke. "This is my home now," she said clearly. "I know what you and Frank did to my father. What you plan to do to Mason. It's over, Margaret." Margaret's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You lying little. You've never been deaf. You heard everything." Her hand disappeared beneath her coat and emerged holding a small derringer. "Frank was right about you all along." Before she could raise the gun, Mason was on his feet, his rifle aimed squarely at Margaret's heart. "Drop it," he commanded. "Now!" The sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Frank Holloway appeared at the head of a column of armed men, their expressions as cold as the mountain air. "You should have killed her when I told you to, Margaret," Frank called, riding up alongside the buggy. "Now she's made things complicated." Margaret turned to him in confusion. "You said we just needed the map to the mine." You promised— I promised whatever would keep you useful, Frank interrupted dismissively. And now you're not. He raised his revolver and fired once. Margaret slumped forward in the buggy, a red stain spreading across her back. The horse startled and bolted, dragging the buggy and its dead passenger back down the road. Now then, Frank said, turning his attention to Mason and Sarah. I believe we have unfinished business regarding a gold mine and some weapons that need safe passage. Mason kept his rifle trained on Frank. You're trespassing on my property, Holloway. That's a hanging offense in these parts. Frank laughed, gesturing to his men. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. The only question is how painful your death will be. He nodded towards Sarah. The girl comes with us. She knows where the map is hidden, even if you don't. I know exactly where it is, Mason replied calmly. I also know your Mexican buyers are getting impatient. They were expecting those rifles last week. Frank's confident smile faltered. How could you possibly— Your men talk too much in town, Mason interrupted, especially when Sheriff Wallace's deputy buys the drinks. As if on cue, a shot rang out from the ridge to the north. One of Frank's men toppled from his saddle. Then another fell. Sheriff Wallace's voice boomed from the tree line. Frank Holloway, you're surrounded. Throw down your weapons. Chaos erupted as Frank's men scattered, caught in a crossfire between Wallace's deputies on the ridge and Mason's cowboys emerging from the barn and bunkhouse. Mason grabbed Sarah and pulled her behind the porch's heavy support beam as bullets splintered the railing around them. Stay here, he ordered, pressing his spare revolver into her hands before charging into the fray. Frank had dismounted and taken cover behind a water trough, firing methodically at anyone who moved. Mason worked his way around the side of the house, using the confusion to get closer. The two men spotted each other simultaneously. Frank's bullet grazed Mason's already wounded shoulder, sending white-hot pain through his body. Mason's shot went wide. They faced each other across 20 feet of blood-stained snow, revolvers aimed, fingers on triggers, a classic Western standoff born of personal hatred and years of waiting. You couldn't save Thomas Cooper, Frank taunted. Just like you couldn't save your wife when the fever took her. You're a man who makes promises he can't keep, Blackwood. Mason's expression remained impassive. Some promises are worth dying for. Frank's finger tightened on the trigger, but the shot that rang out came from behind Mason. Sarah stood on the porch, her stance perfect, the revolver steady in her hands. Frank staggered backward, surprise overtaking his features as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest. That was for my father, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. Frank raised his gun one last time, aiming not at Mason but at Sarah. Mason fired twice, the bullets finding their mark with deadly accuracy. Frank Holloway collapsed into the snow, his legacy of violence ending where it had truly begun, in Echo Valley. Spring came late to the high country that year. The snow retreated grudgingly, revealing grass that seemed surprised to find itself green again. At Blackwood Ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. The stables had been rebuilt, stronger than before. The bullet holes in the main house had been patched, though Mason left one in the doorframe as a reminder. On the crest of a hill overlooking the valley stood a simple wooden marker. Mason knelt beside it, placing a small gold nugget at its base. He'd be proud of you, he said as Sarah approached behind him. Thomas always said you had more courage than sense. Turns out he was right about the courage part. Sarah smiled. Her voice, once so rarely used, now came naturally. What will you do with the mine? What we'll do with it, you mean? Mason corrected, standing. Half of it belongs to you by rights. Your father's will was clear on that. Partners, then? She asked, extending her hand. Mason took it, his calloused palm engulfing her smaller one. Partners. They stood side by side, looking out over Echo Valley, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of fire. Mason's Winchester rested comfortably in the crook of his arm. Sarah wore his spare colt on her hip. They were no longer protector and protected. They had become something else entirely. Equals forged in blood and bullets, bound by promises kept and enemies vanquished. My father said you were the most trustworthy man he ever knew, Sarah said quietly. He was right. Mason nodded once, acknowledgement and gratitude in a single gesture. Together they mounted their horses and turned toward home. Two guardians of Echo Valley riding into a blood-red sunset. The mountains would remember their story long after the snow returned.